Lisa Bolivinaka na evangu ko Elizabeth Koroivulaono, ngone ni Yaroi Matukulau, pasu in particular my viti. And today we're going to talanoa with my creative inspiring islander, Fijian director Toa Fraser. Bula Toa!
Bula, Lizzie. Thank you for having me. This is pretty cool. Thank you.
Awesome. So my first question, before we get into the nitty-gritty work questions, is one about you. How did you get the name Toa?
Ah, funny. Is this a Fiji joke?
You know, only I can ask that.
Yes, so I was named after a Samoan guy, Toa Hutchinson, who lived in Mount Roskill and Glass Road next door to my Uncle Ray. And he made a big impression on my parents in the 70s when they were here, actually from England on their honeymoon. But as we all know, Toa in Samoa and Māori and Tonga means warrior, whereas in Fiji it means...
It means chicken.
Thank you. Nobody has ever asked me that before in an interview. So thank you very much, Lizzie, for putting that out there.
Can you tell us your ties to Fiji?
Yes, my father, Eugene Fraser, was born in Vatukola, and my grandparents are from Levuka. My grandmother, Lola Trail, and my granddad, Jack Fraser. And their sort of ancestry comes through Samoa in the sort of late 1800s. They moved, I guess they went on the sort of migration path to Levuka, and then my family, my dad's family, moved to Auckland in the late 40s, early 1950s.
Did you do any growing up back home?
No, I actually grew up in England. My dad was a very groundbreaking man. He grew up in Mount Roskill, big family in a state house there. And he had sort of aspirations to travel and to see the world, and also to be able to speak English at a very sort of high level. And he used to hide under the house reading books and sneak off to the ballet when he was a teenager, not sort of telling his broader family. And in the end ended up working for the New Zealand Broadcasting Corporation in the 60s, and then went to England to work for the BBC as a newsreader, a radio announcer there for 25 years. Oh, wow. So he met my mum through the glass there at the BBC. She was a sound technician, and she had seen South Pacific, the musical, and therefore she fell in love with my dad, and my dad fell in love with her, and they had a family, and I was born over there, quite a long way from the Pacific.
Speaking of Fiji, number 2 was your feature film debut. Why was it important for you to make it?
It was a personal story. It wasn't, it's fiction, but obviously there were a lot of similarities to not just my family, but other families, other people that I had grown up with and knew, and sort of all those great stories of the old days in Fiji and all the legends and myths and actually legends and myths of Mount Roskill. I remember being a kid in England, and my dad would tell us stories of Mount Roskill in a way that was very mythological, and sort of, it was never a sort of mundane sort of soap opera. It was always very big. Yeah.
Sometimes exaggerated.
Exactly. As Epeli Hauofa, who actually was a bit of a mentor for me when I was writing the first draft of the screenplay of number 2, as he always said, when we told stories in the old days, we told them big. We had big visions and big storytelling. So originally I wrote number 2 as a play for Madeline Sami to perform as a one-woman show in 1999. And she was incredible, and the play was a big success for a young collaborative team. I was only 23 or 24 at the time, and we took it to the Edinburgh Fringe Festival in Jamaica and Mexico and New York and lots of amazing places. And the world, New Zealand and the world and Fiji really embraced her performance in that role. And I remember, when I was writing the play in the backyard, one of the early days of writing it, I was in the backyard in my auntie and uncle's place in Freeland Ave in Mount Roskill, and I remember saying to my teenage cousin, Dronjalangi, I'm not going to sell the film rights to this. I'm going to hold on to the film rights in order to be able to adapt it as a film and direct it as my first feature. And they were, my cousins were all like, yeah, cool, Toa, that sounds
Great
awesome.
idea. Amazing.
Tupac just died, so that's more important right now. But I was lucky enough to meet the right people and hold on for long enough and, spend kind of 5 years writing that. And ultimately got the opportunity to direct it as a feature film.
So what were some of the challenges that you faced when casting for number 2? Because there's not a lot of Fijian actors, and Ruby Dee was important, that role. How did you find her?
We looked within the Fiji community and looked in Fiji a little bit, but very quickly got to the realization that the film, I guess, especially given that it was based on a play, had a sort of certain theatricality and really required, especially as the leader of that cast, somebody who had years of experience to lead the cast and the whole film. And I had been a huge fan of Do the Right Thing, Spike Lee's movie in 1989.
What I tell you about that noise? What I tell you about the pitch?
That was a real inspiration for number 2. And Ruby Dee, who played Mother Sister in that, was kind of the obvious choice. And we asked her agent and didn't hear anything for a long time. And then we were looking around the Pacific, but then one day out of the blue, we got a phone call on a voice message on the answer machine back in those days. And it was a very faint voice, Ruby Dee saying, "Hello, I've read your script and I really want to be involved." And it was a very great day. The day that she arrived in New Zealand, I had been developing this for a long time. And, I had really learned to not get too excited or not too disappointed with all the sort of peaks and troughs along that journey. But the day that she arrived in Auckland, I ripped out a big happy voucher out of the book. That was a day that we really celebrated.
Yeah.
Then the next day, I got a phone call from the producer, Tim White, saying, Ozzie Davis, Ruby Dee's husband, died in New York last night. We're going to fold the movie and Ms. Dee is going home. And I remember at the time just feeling, really kind of honored to have been sort of a small tangential part of that great story. And, didn't really ask for anything else. I went to see her at the hotel before she left. She said they dimmed the lights on Broadway for my husband. And, I just let her go and didn't really know what to do next until she gave us the call that she was coming back. She went to the funeral there and grieved and said goodbye to her husband, Bill Clinton, Wynton Marsalis, Harry Belafonte were all at the funeral, and then she came back 2 weeks later to Mount Roskill to take part in our movie. And she said just before she left to me, "I'm looking forward to coming back and celebrating life with you." So a great honor. And as part of the rehearsal process, we actually made her a feast at my auntie and uncle's place in Freeland Ave. Got all the cast to help my cousins cook the pig and everything, and she was the guest of honor at a real party that reflected the party of the movie.
Once upon a time, bad people ruled the earth.
Sweetooth, a huge international series, one that our young Pasifika and Maori directors can dream to be, you know, but then you did it and here we are. Can you tell us your role on Sweetooth?
So Sweetooth, I was the producing director of season 1 and I directed 2 episodes. So as the producing director, I was basically across all of the episodes, helping support, especially Jim Mickle, the showrunner, and the creator, and sort of guiding the production through the various scripts, working with the writers in Los Angeles, and communicating, facilitating with the production design, the art department, and the the costume department, and the actors. And it was you know, again, you know, I say I was very lucky to be involved.
Were there any synergies with your Pacific Island worldview and the story of Sweetooth?
Yes, I think so. Especially given that, you know, my particular Pacific worldview has been one of estrangement, I guess, from growing up in England. I really identified with this story of a kid who has grown up sort of out of place and is looking for a place in the world and looking for his heritage. You know, I always tell my kids that the analogy roots doesn't really work for our family. You know, they're into that song, the 660 song, Know Your Roots.
How does it go?
I don't know this. But thank you for asking. I'll have to get my daughter to come and sing it for us. Don't forget your roots,
Yes,
I believe.
that's the one.
But you know, our family in every generation has been at sea. You know, my dad came from Fiji to New Zealand and went on a boat to England, which was like a 3-month trip and a very life-changing one at that. My grandfather was a sailor and a wharfie, and they moved from Levuka to Viti Levu to come here. And before them, in every generation, there's been a sort of wandering, looking over the horizon. And it's always been a sort of sea-based thing. So I feel like the sea is the more appropriate sort of place for our sort of belonging. I don't know how that relates to Sweetooth necessarily, but...
Something in there. Jim? So being Fijian and a director at your level, I hope you know that you're making dreams become a reality for little Fijians back home. So when did you decide, oh, I want to be a TV film director?
When I was 3 years old. So my English nana, who I loved and who loved me, was a big fan of the movies of the old days, you know, Humphrey Bogart and Errol Flynn and all those sort of Hollywood, the classic Hollywood things. And growing up in England, you know, I always felt, even though I'm very fair and, you know, could fit in on paper, I always felt very sort of outside the culture there, I guess. Not really knowing that that was what I was feeling, but that was what was happening. And she really encouraged my passion from a very early age. We went to see Raiders of the Lost Ark when I was, I don't know, about 6 or something. And it's crazy how important that particular movie has been for so many filmmakers of my generation, you know, across the world. And also at the same time, you know, I'm growing up with my dad telling me Fiji myths and legends and stories, as I said before, of, you know, the family in Mount Roskill and his adventures in Fiji and his adventures here. So I had this mix of like Hollywood inspiration and the very specific inspiration that my dad was pulling from the Pacific. And I just grew up in that sort of storytelling sort of culture, so I was very lucky.
So what are some of the other projects that you've worked on and what are the highlights?
Whoa, so I've worked on a lot of projects.
Okay,
and
top 3.
Top 3.
For Sweetooth.
So, you know, number 2 obviously was my first and very heartfelt project that changed my life, I guess. We won an award at the Sundance Film Festival, and that year was a complete sort of turning point for me in all sorts of ways. Dean Spanley, the film I made a couple of years, or about a year and a half after number 2 with Peter O'Toole and Sam Neill. Again, very lucky to be part of that, and a great cast. It was a complete turnaround. It was a very sort of buttoned up English dramedy, I guess, family comedy that was set in England in the early 1900s. We went from a state house to a stately home in that sort of trajectory. And then I guess I had a bit of a period where I was writing a lot. I tried doing that thing with Jonah, that didn't happen. And then ultimately sort of came back with I ultimately came back with an action film, The Deadlands, which again was, really profound, moving, life-changing experience. The cast on that film were incredible, the culture that they sort of brought to the whole project, the training and the tikanga that we all sort of practiced on that movie was just made for such a profound experience. I guess pretty soon after that, I branched out into TV and did an episode of Penny Dreadful, which again was one of those profound sort of numinous moments where I wasn't really looking for anything. I was on holiday actually with the kids at the time, and I had said to them I'm turning my phone off for kind of the first time. But my manager in LA called me and said, we've got a project for you. And I did the interview for it, and it was a very tight script, very beautiful script by the legendary John Logan. And for that project, it was a short time, but I spent, I guess, 13 days locked up in one set, or 2 sets, but mostly one insane asylum cell with Ava Green, Rory Kinnear and Patti LuPone, which was kind of, it was an incredible process because we were able to do it like the sort of theatre rehearsals that I had been used to at the start of my career.
You said you got interviewed, so like for projects that aren't yours and then they search out directors, so they interview directors for projects?
Yeah.
That role does happen still?
So in TV and streaming shows especially, episodic directors. So most of the time, and not everybody knows this, but most of the time on shows, there is more than one director. Sweetooth, for example, Jim Mickle, the showrunner and creator of the show, he ended up doing 4 out of 8, which is actually quite unusual for the showrunner to do any episodes, but he did 4. I did 2, Robin Grace did 1, and Alexis Ostrander did 1. So on any given show, like The Rookie, a TV cop show that I did in the States, there's one director per episode. So the showrunner and the studio and the network will interview the directors, and you go through.
What do they ask you? Do they ask you your vision, or do they give you the script and be like, tell us how you see it, and then they choose you? Or do they?
It's kind of an audition. I mean, I always feel like the best ones are the ones where you just connect with somebody and you're talking about inspirations and sort of, things that you like and things that you've done before. And the best ones don't feel like an interview. They just feel like a connection of minds. Certainly some of them are very brief and, sort of just say, yep, you seem cool. You've got a great CV. You're hired, and then other times you really have to go through the process of 4 different meetings for the showrunner, the studio, the network, and executive producers or whatever. So it can be quite a big process. And I haven't been doing it for that long, really. TV stuff, I've only been doing that for the last, I guess, 4 or 5 years. So I'm still kind of a newbie in arena.
Cool. So our industry is very ruthless. How have you navigated it as a Pacific Islander?
It's challenging. You know, I remember with number 2, I had worked so hard on that and, you know, committed to that for like 5 years, and I hadn't thought of what I wanted to do next at all. And when I finally made it and premiered it at Sundance, there was a lot of attention on me for that brief amount of time, you know, in the couple of weeks following it. And, you know, I had a lot of meetings in LA, and a lot of people were saying, well, you seem really exciting. What do you want to do next? And I don't know if it's just my personality or if it's sort of a Fiji thing, but I really, you know, I went very quiet.
Going to a turtle? Did you turtle away?
My-
Is
my-
that what
this-
that is? Yes.
I went into my safe place,
Yeah.
the turtle zone. And, you know, if the Fiji sort of culture and personality is modest and quiet. And I have found at times a conflict between that sort of instinct and the prouder, sort of louder Los Angeles sort of way of doing things. I have, you know, I haven't changed much, so I feel like, you know, I feel more comfortable in that place now, and I feel like people have come to me more and kind of understand my way of doing things more. But certainly that sort of contrast was very difficult to handle at the time.
So for the Fijian audience who think that because you have the same surname as another person
Oh,
that
yeah.
you're related, we'll just like put this to bed. Are you related to Brooke Fraser?
So we are related to the Frasers from Lautoka somehow. It's not actually it's not the same Fraser family, but I do believe, actually I asked my cousin Greg Trail the other day for the detail, and it was almost more confusing than before.
Yes.
Because I believe we're related on both sides of my grandfather's side and my grandmother's side.
So that's a yes.
But certainly I was always very proud as a kid in England of being related to Bernie Fraser, Brooke's dad. So yes, I will claim that part of my family heritage and Pacific actors.
How important is it, like, because we're in front of the screen as Pacific Islander, you know, with acting and stuff, how important is it for you as a creative behind this lens to see us, to see more Pacific Island people being in the different roles?
It's so important. You know, we talk about diversity and representation matters. And, you know, I remember feeling that very strongly when I was in my sort of early 20s, when I was, you know, writing things, in my teenage years, when I was writing things like Nico Thunderbolt, that I wanted to see a reflection of my background on the screen. I guess that's why I ended up writing and directing number 2 as my first feature. And I guess that comes especially from my specific place of being, I guess, not a typical Pacific story, and not to say that anybody has a typical Pacific story. You know, we within the Pacific are diverse. So, as you know, I've always said, as many versions of our stories that we can get told, the better.
What inspiring work do you see coming out of Pacific storytelling on this side of the world?
So I was very fortunate last year while I was in New Zealand waiting for Sweetooth to happen to be aware of and slightly involved in the Tene Sa series of short films. And I felt like some of the young talent involved in that project is very exciting, and it was really great to hang around with that project.
Cool. Is there more work coming from you? Are you writing, developing any of your own stories?
Yes, I have enjoyed being back in the Pacific. You know, it's been a long time since I traveled. Most, as I said before, you know, in my family, travel is a really big thing, and you know, I haven't traveled, I guess, for a year and a half now. So I have enjoyed being back and writing stories, reconnecting with that sort of part of my consciousness or unconscious that created, I guess, number 2 in the first place, and hooking back into that sort of heritage of stories.
And lastly, what brought you home? I remember, when I still hung out, you talked about like the wind changed. Can you tell us that story?
Yeah, it was a very powerful moment. It was Sweetooth on the surface. It was Sweetooth that brought me home, definitely. But after a few years of wandering, and really wandering, I wasn't in one place for much longer than 6 weeks at a time for the last few years. Going from New Mexico to Toronto to Vancouver to New York and various other places. There did come a point when I was talking to the Sweetooth people that I woke up in a hotel room in Rhode Island and really felt like there had been a change in the wind and that I was headed back to the Pacific. And it has been it has been a profound experience to be back here for the last year and a half.
Awesome. Yuna kavakalebu to Toa for joining us today. Hope you enjoyed our Talanoa. See you next week.
See you next week, everybody.